The dust of Deadwood Gulch tasted like grit and sorrow. It clung to the back of your throat, a constant reminder that in 1873, the American West was a place that would chew you up and spit you out without a second thought. Margaret stood on the edge of that forgotten town, her gaze fixed on the orphanage. It wasn't a home. It was a cage made of rotting timber and shattered dreams, a place where hope went to die. 6 months. It had been 6 months since she'd buried her husband, William. 6 months since the silence in their small ranch house had grown from a quiet hum to a deafening roar. The loneliness was a living thing now, a predator that stalked her through the empty rooms, its claws digging deeper with every sunset that painted the sky in colors she could no longer share. Her weathered hand tightened around a small leather pouch. Inside, the weight of $27 felt both heavy and insignificant. It was everything. Everything she had left after the funeral, after the doctor, after the endless expenses of a ranch that one person could barely manage alone. But the money wasn't the problem. The silence was. The echoes of a life that was, of children's laughter they had dreamed of but never heard, were driving her mad. So she'd hitched up old Jasper, her sway-backed horse, and ridden the 2 hours to Deadwood Gulch, to the one place she'd sworn she'd never go. The keeper of the orphanage, a woman named Miss Henderson, had a face like a dried-up creek bed and a voice as sharp as a shard of glass. She led Margaret down a dim, narrow corridor where the air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage, dampness, and something else. Despair. Muffled sounds drifted from behind closed doors, not the joyful shouts of children playing, but the choked-off sobs and hollow murmurs of ghosts in the making. "These 3 are the last of the lot," Miss Henderson said, her words clipped and devoid of any warmth. She gestured toward a dark, barren room at the end of the hall. "Hardest to place. Nobody wants 'em. They come as a set, you see. A package deal. Won't be separated." She paused, leaning in conspiratorially. "And between you and me, they have their peculiarities." Margaret's breath caught in her chest. In the corner of the room, sitting on overturned wooden crates, were 3 small figures. They sat unnervingly still, like porcelain dolls left forgotten in an attic. But it was the things on their heads that made Margaret's skin crawl. Each child wore a burlap sack, a crude, grimy mask with rough holes torn out for their eyes. The sacks were cinched around their necks with frayed pieces of rope, hiding them completely from the world. Why are their heads covered?" Margaret whispered, the question feeling heavy and profane in the suffocating air. Miss Henderson let out a short, harsh laugh. "Who knows? They refused to take them off. Been wearing those things for months. Last family that took a look at them brought them back inside of an hour. Said they gave them the shivers. Said there was something deeply unnatural about it." She looked Margaret up and down, a flicker of predatory calculation in her eyes. "But you look like a woman who isn't easily spooked, and I'm prepared to make you a deal. You take all 3, right now, no questions asked, and they're yours for $25. Margaret couldn't look away from the 3 small, masked figures. The smallest, who looked to be no more than 6, sat with a rigid stillness that was profoundly unsettling. The middle child, maybe 8 years old, kept their covered head tilted, turning slowly toward the sound of Margaret's voice as if tracking prey. The oldest, perhaps 10, had their small hands folded neatly in their lap, a posture of unnerving calm. They were a tableau of silent misery. "What are their names?" Margaret asked, her heart aching for them. Miss Henderson's bitter laugh echoed in the small room. "That's the best part. They won't tell us, won't speak a word. Not to me, not to anyone. We just call them 1, 2, and 3. Oldest is 1, middle is 2, little one is 3. 1, 2, and 3. They weren't even children anymore. They were inventory, stripped of their faces, their voices, their very names. A sharp memory of William pierced through her grief, him saying that every creature, no matter how small or broken, deserved dignity, deserved a name, deserved love. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the reason her heart had dragged her here, not just to quiet her own loneliness, but to answer theirs. "I'll take them," Margaret said, her voice quiet but firm. Miss Henderson's thin eyebrows shot up in surprise. "All three? Just like that? With those things on their heads?" "All three," Margaret confirmed, her hand already reaching for the leather pouch. She pulled out the worn bills, the money that was supposed to see her through the winter, and placed them in Miss Henderson's eager hand. The woman's fingers snapped shut around the cash like a trap. "Good. They're your problem now." She didn't offer paperwork. She didn't offer any history. She just took the money, turned on her heel, and walked away, the sound of her footsteps retreating down the long, dark hall. The door at the end of the corridor slammed shut, plunging the room into near darkness, and Margaret was left alone. Alone with the three silent, motionless, masked children. The only sound was her own ragged breathing and the thudding of her heart. She looked at the burlap sacks, at the dark holes where their eyes should be, and for the first time, a cold sliver of fear pierced her resolve. What had she just done? The wagon ride back to the ranch was a study in silence, a thick, oppressive silence that was 100 times worse than the emptiness of her house. Jasper's steady clip-clop on the dusty road and the groan of the wagon wheels were the only sounds in the world. In the back, the three children sat in a perfectly straight line, their sack-covered heads occasionally turning in eerie, synchronized unison to watch the passing landscape of jagged rocks and sun-scorched earth. Margaret found her eyes darting to the small mirror she'd fixed to the wagon's side, catching glimpses of them. Their stillness was unnerving. They didn't fidget. They didn't whisper. They just sat, watching, waiting. For what, she didn't dare to guess. Every time she looked, it felt like they were staring right back at her, their gazes piercing through the rough fabric of their masks. Her ranch was a humble place, but it was a good place. The small house, built by William's own strong hands, had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room that was warm and clean. The barn was sturdy, the well never ran dry, and the land, though stubborn, had always provided. It wasn't much, but it was a home built on love. "This is it," Margaret said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud as she helped them down from the wagon. "This is where you'll live now. I know it isn't fancy, but it's safe, and there's always food on the table." The 3 children stood in a row before the house, their sack-covered heads tilting up to take in the sight. The setting sun bled across the sky, casting long, menacing shadows that seemed to crawl from the corners of the yard. Through the eye-holes of their sacks, Margaret could see their eyes, wide, dark, and unnervingly observant. They weren't just looking at a house, they were assessing it. That first night was a trial. Margaret prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread, the familiar smells doing little to comfort her. She set 4 places at the small wooden table, her hands trembling as she did. It was the first time in 6 long months the table wasn't set for just one. A wave of grief and a strange, new fear washed over her in equal measure. "You can sit wherever you like," she offered, trying to keep her voice gentle. They moved without a word. The oldest, 1, took the seat at the head of the table, directly opposite Margaret, the chair that had always been William's. The middle child, 2, sat to her right, and the youngest 3 to her left, boxing her in. The meal began. Margaret watched, mesmerized in horror as they ate. Each child would lift the bottom of their burlap sack just enough to reveal a small, pale mouth. They'd take a bite, then the sack would drop back into place. There was no sound of chewing, no clatter of forks against plates, just a silent, mechanical process of consumption. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Margaret had to break it. "I know Miss Henderson called you by numbers," she began, her voice strained. "But that's no way for a person to live. Everyone deserves a proper name. If you want, I can give you names. Or you can tell me what you'd like to be called." The three sack-covered heads turned slightly, a chillingly coordinated movement. They seemed to look at each other, communicating in a way she couldn't comprehend. But they remained silent. That's all right," Margaret stammered, feeling a growing sense of dread. "We have plenty of time. For now, I'll just call you my children, if that's okay with you." The smallest child, 3, slowly turned its head to face her. And then it gave a single, deliberate nod. Margaret let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But the relief was short-lived. Later that night, as she lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, she heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. Then another. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't alone in this house anymore, and she had no idea what she had brought into it. She strained her ears, listening. A soft, rhythmic scratching sound started, coming from the children's room. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was the sound of a nail on wood, slow and deliberate. Margaret lay frozen in her bed, the silence of her grief replaced by a new and terrible sound. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, a chilling lullaby in the dead of night. She finally drifted into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a nightmare of 3 small figures standing over her bed, their burlap sacks blotting out the moonlight. The next morning, the house was silent again. The children were already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, perfectly still. Sunlight streamed through the window, but it did nothing to dispel the cold knot of fear in Margaret's stomach. When she went to their room to collect the laundry, she saw it. On the floor, etched into the soft pine planks with what must have been a nail, was a drawing. It was a crude, childish rendering of her ranch house, but there was something terribly wrong with it. Next to the house was the small, fenced-off plot where William was buried. There was his headstone, a simple wooden cross, and next to it was a second, smaller cross. Margaret stared at the drawing, her blood turning to ice. This wasn't just a child's doodle. It was a premonition, a threat. She looked from the scratched drawing on the floor to the 3 silent children in the other room. They hadn't just brought their silence and their sacks into her home. They had brought a warning. Days bled into weeks, and Margaret's life settled into a new, terrifying rhythm. The children were ghosts in her home, shadows that flitted at the edge of her vision. They were surprisingly helpful, performing chores with a quiet efficiency that was more robotic than human. They fed the chickens, collected the eggs, and weeded the garden, moving with a synchronized grace that was deeply unnatural. They always worked together, always in silence, save for the occasional, hushed whisper that would stop the moment she came near. They slept in the spare bedroom, not in the beds Margaret had offered, but on the floor, lined up in a neat row, 1, 2, and 3, like bodies laid out for a funeral. They seemed to draw a strange comfort from their proximity, a shared darkness that Margaret couldn't penetrate. She started noticing things, small details that only deepened the mystery. One, the oldest, was fiercely protective. If a neighbor rode by on the road, he would physically place himself in front of the other 2, his small body rigid, his masked face turned toward the perceived threat. 2, the middle child, had startlingly delicate hands and seemed to know things about cooking and herbs that no child should know, silently adding pinches of things to the stew when Margaret wasn't looking. And 3, the youngest, had a habit of tilting its head, as if listening to a frequency only it could hear, its eyes through the burlap holes fixed on empty corners of the room. One evening, Margaret was mending a pair of William's old work trousers by the lamplight, the familiar task a small comfort in her increasingly strange world. She heard the softest of footsteps and looked up. 3 stood in the doorway, a small, still silhouette against the dark hallway. "Can't sleep, little one?" Margaret asked, her voice softer than she intended. The child, or whatever it was, nodded and moved slowly, deliberately into the room. It sat on the floor near her chair, so close she could hear the faint, whispery sound of its breathing through the thick burlap. The air around the child felt cold. Trying to bridge the chasm between them, Margaret kept her hands busy with the needle and thread. "You know," she began, her voice low and even, "when I was your age, I was afraid of lots of things. The dark, loud noises, strangers." She glanced down at the small, sack-covered head. "My mama used to say that the things we use to protect ourselves, the walls we build, sometimes they can become prisons. They don't just keep the bad things out. They can keep the good things from getting in, too." 3's head turned sharply toward her. Through the eye holes, Margaret felt an intense, focused gaze. It felt ancient. For a long, silent moment, the child just watched her. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it stood up and walked back into the darkness of the hall. Margaret's words had hung in the air, but she had no idea if they had been received as comfort or as a challenge. The next morning brought a visitor she had been dreading, Sheriff Coleman. He rode up on his tall bay horse, his face, weathered by sun and worry, looking more serious than usual under the brim of his wide hat. Margaret met him on the porch, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Morning, Margaret," he said, tipping his hat. His eyes, however, didn't hold their usual friendly glint. They were sharp, searching. "Don't mind me stopping by unannounced, but I heard some disturbing talk in town. Heard you took in some children from that place in Deadwood Gulch." "That's right, Sheriff," Margaret replied, forcing her voice to be steady. She stood a little taller. 3 of them. Is there a problem?" Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his gaze sweeping over her small house, as if looking for signs of a struggle. "Well, that's the thing. There's been talk. People are spooked, Margaret, saying strange things about these children, about the sacks they wear. Some folks are saying it ain't natural, that it's the mark of something unholy." A fierce, protective instinct, one she hadn't felt in years, flared in Margaret's chest. "They're just children, Sheriff, frightened children. They've been through God knows what. If they need to hide their faces for a while, then that says more about the cruelty of the world than it does about them." The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. "I understand your feelings, Margaret, I truly do. You've always had a big heart. But I have to ask, have they done anything unusual? Said anything about where they came from? Who their people were?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. Last spring, a family over in Redemption County took in 3 orphans. A few weeks later, the whole family just vanished. The homestead was empty, except for 3 little burlap sacks left on the kitchen table." The world tilted. Margaret gripped the porch railing to keep from falling. Vanished. They don't speak," she managed to say, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "They're quiet. They help with chores. They eat their meals and they sleep. If that's strange, then I suppose I'm strange, too." Sheriff Coleman studied her face for a long, agonizing moment. "You're a good woman, Margaret. William always said so, but you be careful. You be damned careful. There are things in this world that prey on good women with big hearts. If anything odd happens, anything at all, you send word. You hear me?" He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating sense of dread in his wake. As he disappeared down the road, Margaret saw them. The 3 children, standing at the living room window, their masked faces turned toward her. They hadn't just been inside. They'd been listening, and she knew, with a certainty, that chilled her to the bone, that they had heard every single word. That afternoon, the air on the ranch felt different, tense, charged. Margaret tried to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of gardening, her hands digging into the cool earth, but she couldn't shake the sheriff's words. A family vanished. 3 burlap sacks left behind. She glanced over at the children. They were huddled together by the edge of the woods, whispering. Their whispers were different today, more urgent, more agitated. They kept casting furtive glances back at her. What were they planning? Were they the same children? Had she brought a curse into her home? Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She had to know. She had to do something. But what? Confront them? They wouldn't speak. Send them back? Miss Henderson had made it clear they were her problem now. She was trapped. She was pulling weeds with a vengeance, yanking them from the soil, when a soft voice spoke from directly behind her. "Margaret!" She gasped, spinning around so fast she nearly fell. 3 stood there just a few feet away. The burlap-covered head was tilted in that same unnerving way. You spoke," Margaret breathed, her heart hammering. "You said my name." "Margaret," the child repeated. The voice was small and muffled by the sack, but it was clear, and it was the first word any of them had spoken directly to her. Tears of shock and a bizarre sense of relief pricked at her eyes. It was just a child's voice. "Yes," she said, her own voice trembling. "Yes, that's my name." She knelt down in the dirt, trying to make herself less intimidating. "And what's yours, little one? Can you tell me your name?" The child was silent for a long moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, with movements that seemed ancient and deliberate, 2 small hands reached up. They fumbled with the frayed rope tied around the child's neck. "Wait," Margaret said, a new wave of anxiety washing over her. She'd wanted this, hadn't she? To see their faces? But now, in this moment, she was terrified of what she might find. A monster? A scarred, disfigured face? The face of a demon? "You don't have to. Not if you're not ready." But the child ignored her. The knot came undone. The burlap sack was lifted, and it fell to the ground. Margaret's gasp wasn't one of horror. It was one of impossible, soul-shattering recognition. The child standing before her was beautiful. Dirty, yes, with smudges on her cheeks and hair the color of sun-bleached wheat, but beautiful. And familiar. Terribly. Impossibly familiar. She had the same stubborn set to her chin as William, the same sprinkle of freckles across her nose that Margaret saw in her own reflection. But it was the eyes that stole her breath and stopped her heart. They were green, a deep forest green, exactly like her late husband's. They were William's eyes, staring back at her from a child's face. "Ellie," the little girl whispered, her voice clear and sweet now that the sack was gone. "My name is Ellie." Margaret's world fractured. The sky, the trees, the very ground beneath her knees seemed to tilt and spin. Ellie. The name she and William had chosen for the daughter they had lost in a miscarriage years ago. The secret name they had whispered only to each other in the dark. A name no one else on earth knew. "How?" Margaret choked out, her voice a raw, broken thing. "How do you know that name?" The little girl, Ellie, looked at her with those impossible green eyes, and her expression was not one of a child, but of something ancient and knowing. "Because you're my mama," she said, her voice filled with a simple, devastating certainty. "And I've been waiting for you. We've all been waiting." Margaret's mind reeled, unable to process the words, the face, the name. She sank to her knees in the dirt, the garden forgotten, the sheriff's warning a distant echo. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the girl's cheek. The skin was warm, real. I don't understand," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Ellie glanced over her shoulder, toward where 1 and 2 were now walking slowly toward them, their own sacks still hiding their faces. "We're not like other children, Mama," she said, her voice dropping lower. "We remember things from before. We remember being wanted. We remember being loved. We remember the names you gave us." She pointed a small, dirt-caked finger at the other 2 children who had stopped a few feet away. "James," she said, pointing at 1. "And Sarah," she said, pointing at 2. The other names. The names for the 2 sons she and William had prayed for after losing Ellie, the children they had never been able to conceive. James and Sarah. Margaret felt the world dissolve into a dizzying vortex of grief and wonder. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a hallucination brought on by sorrow. "When Papa William died," Ellie continued, her green eyes holding Margaret's captive, "we felt your sadness. It was like a lighthouse in the dark. It was so strong. We felt how much you missed him, how much you still wanted us. So we came. We came to the place we knew you would find us. The orphanage, it was just a doorway. A doorway. The word hung in the air, filled with a terrifying, magical weight. The West was full of strange tales, of spirits and mysteries that defied easy explanation. But this was too personal, too impossible. "But how?" Margaret asked again, her rational mind screaming for an explanation that didn't exist. Before Ellie could answer, the oldest child, James, reached up and pulled off his own sack. He had William's strong jawline and Margaret's own dark, wavy hair. Then the middle child, Sarah, removed hers. She had Margaret's delicate nose and mouth, but her eyes were a soft, gentle brown, exactly like William's. They were the perfect, impossible blend of the 2 of them. The children of their dreams, made flesh. They were real. Margaret stared at the 3 of them, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She looked at James, the oldest, the protector. She looked at Sarah, the quiet helper. She looked at Ellie, the little listener. Their personalities, their strange behaviors. It all started to click into a terrifying, beautiful new picture. But as the initial shock began to subside, a cold, practical question wormed its way into her mind. She thought of William, of their life together. Her gaze fell on the children's hands. They were small, but they weren't the hands of newborns. They were the hands of children who were 6, 8, 10 years old. "If you are who you say you are," Margaret said, her voice trembling with the weight of the question, "then where have you been? William and we lost Ellie years ago. We never had James or Sarah. You are children, not babies. Where did you come from?" James, the oldest, stepped forward. His expression was serious, far too grim for a 10-year-old boy. "The place we were, Mama. It's not like this one. It's a quiet place, a gray place. It's where the ones who are wanted but not yet born wait. It's cold there," Sarah added, her voice a soft whisper. "And you can't touch anything. You can just watch. We watched you and Papa for a long, long time. We heard you whisper our names. When Papa died," James continued, his eyes dark with the memory, "your love for him and your longing for us became a rope thrown from your world into ours. We held on to it, all 3 of us." Margaret tried to picture it, a cold, gray limbo filled with the spirits of unborn children. It was a thought both beautiful and horrifying. "So you crossed over?" "Not at first," Ellie said, shaking her head. "The rope wasn't strong enough. We needed more. We needed a vessel." Margaret frowned. "A vessel? What do you mean?" Sarah shifted her feet, looking down at the ground. "There are children here, in this world, who are empty. Children who have been so hurt, so broken, that their spirit gives up. They just fade away. They leave a space behind." A horrifying realization dawned on Margaret. She thought of the orphanage, a place overflowing with broken children. You mean, you took over their bodies? The question was grotesque, but she had to ask. No, James said, his voice sharp with indignation. Never. We would never do that. That's what the hungry ones do. Hungry ones? Margaret repeated, her blood running cold. The gray place isn't empty, Mama, Ellie whispered, her eyes wide with fear. There are other things there, old things, things that were never wanted. They are formless and angry. They are hungry for life. When a door opens, like the one you made, they try to slip through. She shuddered. The family the sheriff told you about, the one that vanished, they opened a door with their sadness. But they weren't strong enough. Something else came through, something hungry. The pieces slammed into place with dizzying force. The town's fear wasn't just superstition. It was a memory of a real tragedy. The sacks, the silence. It wasn't a test for her. It was a defense. The sacks, James explained, confirming her thoughts. This world, it's so loud, so bright. It hurts. The sacks helped us hold on. They helped us filter everything out until we were strong enough, until your love made us solid. We had to be sure, Sarah added softly. We had to be sure it was you. If we showed our faces to the wrong person, the hungry ones could find us. So the children weren't the danger. They were the survivors. They were her children, born not of flesh and blood in the normal way, but forged in the crucible of love and loss and pulled across a dimensional barrier into the bodies of children who had already given up on life. Vessels. Empty shells they had filled with their own souls, the souls that had always belonged to her and William. It was a miracle. A terrifying, complicated, impossible miracle. She looked at their faces, her hair, William's eyes, her chin, William's smile, and the last of her doubt washed away, replaced by a fierce, primal wave of love. These were her children. No matter how they had gotten here, they were hers. Come here, she said, her voice thick with emotion, opening her arms. They rushed into her embrace, 3 solid, warm bodies pressing against her. For the first time, she wasn't hugging silent, masked mysteries. She was hugging James, Sarah, and Ellie, her children. She buried her face in their hair, breathing in their scent, and wept. Wept for the years she had lost, for the husband she missed, and for the unbelievable gift she had been given. For a few weeks, the ranch was transformed. It was no longer a place of silence and shadows, but one filled with the sounds Margaret had only ever dreamed of. Laughter, questions, the patter of running feet. The children, freed from their burlap prisons, began to blossom. Their personalities, once muted and strange, emerged in full color. James was serious and thoughtful, a natural leader who took his role as eldest brother to heart. Sarah was gentle and artistic, spending hours drawing pictures of flowers and animals with a skill that was uncanny. And Ellie was a whirlwind of curious energy, her green eyes sparkling with questions about everything from the chickens to the stars. They told her more about the gray place, painting a picture of a vast, silent emptiness where they had watched the world of the living like a distant play. They told her how they had felt William's love as a constant warmth, and how his sudden death had been like a light being extinguished, leaving only Margaret's grief as a beacon. Papa helped us, Ellie explained one evening as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies. Before he left completely, he found the locket. He put our names inside and pushed it through. He knew you'd need a sign. The locket. Margaret pulled it from her dress pocket, where she now kept it at all times. So it had been a message from William, a final gift to guide his children home to her. The thought brought both comfort and a fresh wave of sorrow. The town, for its part, remained wary. The story of Margaret's strange orphans, who suddenly had faces and names, spread like wildfire. Some whispered that she was a witch, that she'd consorted with dark forces. Others simply crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her, their faces tight with suspicion. Margaret ignored them. Let them whisper. She had her family. That was all that mattered. The peace, however, was fragile. It was a thin veneer over a deep, unsettling truth. And soon, cracks began to appear. It started subtly. A tool from the barn would be found in the middle of the yard. A window would be found open when Margaret was certain she had locked it. At night, she'd hear strange noises, not the scratching of the children, but a low, guttural sound, like a large animal growling just outside the house. She'd dismiss it as a coyote or a bear, but a cold unease began to settle in her bones. One night, she was woken by a scream. She shot out of bed, her heart seizing with terror, and ran to the children's room. She found them huddled together on one bed, their eyes wide with fear, staring at the window. "What is it? What's wrong?" she cried. "The shadow," James whispered, his voice trembling. He pointed a shaking finger toward the window pane. A big shadow. It was looking in. Margaret rushed to the window but saw nothing but the moonlit yard. "It was just a dream, sweetheart," she soothed, though her own heart was pounding. "It wasn't a dream," Sarah sobbed, burying her face in James's shoulder. "It was tall, and it didn't have a face. A faceless shadow." The words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. The animal growls became more frequent, closer. The children grew more withdrawn, their laughter fading, the light in their eyes dimming. They started glancing nervously at dark corners and jumping at sudden noises. The fear they had left behind in the gray place was seeping back into their new lives. One afternoon, Margaret was in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread, when she felt a sudden, intense cold. The air grew heavy, thick, and the cheerful sunlight streaming through the window seemed to dim. The room was filled with a palpable sense of malice. Then she heard the whisper. It was a voice that slivered into her ear, a cold, dead sound that was a twisted mockery of a human voice. "They are not yours." Margaret froze, the dough forgotten under her hands. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. "You stole them," the voice hissed, seeming to come from all around her. "They belong to the gray. They belong to me." Suddenly, Ellie ran into the kitchen, her face pale with terror. "Mama!" she cried, rushing to Margaret's side. "It's here! The hungry one! It followed us!" At that moment, the temperature in the room plummeted. A shadow fell across the kitchen floor, a patch of darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the light. It coalesced in the corner of the room, a tall, man-shaped silhouette of pure black, featureless and empty. It didn't have a face, just as Sarah had said. It was a void, a hole in the world, and it was staring right at them. Margaret instinctively grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove, her only thought to protect her children. She pushed Ellie behind her, her body trembling but her resolve hardening into steel. "Get out of my house," she snarled. The shadow seemed to ripple, and the whisper slithered through the air again. But this time, the voice was different. This time, it was a voice she knew better than her own, a voice that shattered her heart. Margaret. It was William's voice. "Margaret, my love, what have you done?" The voice whispered, full of pain and sorrow. "These are not our children. They are monsters, demons who have taken their names. I am waiting for you, my love. Let them go. Send them back to the darkness where they belong, and come be with me." The faceless shadow pulsed, and the children behind her cried out in pain. Margaret risked a glance back. Their forms were flickering, becoming translucent, as if the shadow was draining the very reality from them. Their anchor, her love and belief, was being attacked at its source. The entity was using her deepest love and her deepest grief as a weapon against her. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. William's voice. It sounded so real, so full of the love she missed more than breath itself. Doubt, poisonous and cold, crept into her heart. Was he right? Had she been fooled? Had her loneliness made her blind to the truth? Were these beautiful children just a monstrous illusion? The shadow creature extended a long tendril of darkness toward her. Let them go, Margaret. I'm waiting. She looked at the flickering, terrified faces of her children. James, trying to be brave. Sarah, weeping silently. Ellie, her green eyes, William's eyes, wide with a desperate plea. Then she looked at the formless shadow wearing her husband's voice like a stolen coat. And in that moment, something inside her snapped. She remembered something William used to say, a simple truth they had built their life on. Love isn't about what you've lost, Maggie, he'd tell her. It's about what you build day by day. The real William, the man she had loved, would never ask her to abandon their children. He wouldn't ask her to choose between him and them. He would tell her to fight. "You are not my husband," she screamed, her voice ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. She raised the heavy skillet. "My husband gave me these children. My husband would protect this family. You are nothing but a thief and a liar." She took a step forward, then another. The entity recoiled, the shadow wavering as if struck by a physical blow. Her certainty, her absolute, unwavering love, was a weapon it couldn't defend against. "This is our home," she roared, her grief and fear transmuting into pure, righteous fury. "Built with love and hard work, and you are not welcome here." On the mantel, next to the clock, was their family Bible, the one William had given her on their wedding day. With her free hand, she lunged for it, grabbing the heavy, leather-bound book. She held it up like a shield, the skillet held ready like a sword. "In the name of God, and in the name of the love that built this family," she shouted, her voice shaking the very timbers of the house, "I command you to leave this place." She stood there, a lone woman in a simple ranch house, flanked by 3 impossible children, facing down a creature from a nightmare. She planted her feet, holding the Bible aloft. The shadow let out a deafening shriek, a sound of pure rage and agony that was not of this world. It was the sound of tearing fabric, of breaking glass, of a soul being ripped apart. The windows rattled in their frames. The air crackled with energy. Light, brilliant and pure, erupted from the Bible in her hand. It wasn't a gentle glow. It was a blinding, cleansing fire. It slammed into the faceless shadow, and the darkness sizzled and dissolved like smoke in the wind. The cold in the room vanished, replaced by a sudden, encompassing warmth. The shriek died away, leaving only a profound, ringing silence. Margaret stood trembling, the heavy Bible in her hand, the skillet lowered. The shadow was gone. She turned to her children. They were solid again, the flickering gone. They stared at the empty corner, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. Then they looked at her. And they ran into her arms, their sobs of relief echoing in the quiet kitchen. Margaret sank to the floor, pulling them into a fierce, protective embrace. She had not just welcomed a miracle into her life. She had fought for it. She had defended her family from the darkness itself. And she had won. In the aftermath of the battle, a deep and abiding peace settled over the ranch. The oppressive sense of being watched was gone, replaced by the familiar comfort of home. The children's laughter returned, louder and more joyful than before. The light was back in their eyes. They were safe. They were finally, truly home. The story of Margaret's confrontation with the shadow became a whispered legend in the town, though no one knew the full truth. They only knew that the strange, dark feeling that had lingered around the widow's ranch was gone, and that Margaret and her 3 unusual children seemed to be surrounded by a palpable aura of peace. The townsfolk's fear slowly morphed into a kind of grudging respect, and then, eventually, into acceptance. They were different, yes, but they were a family. And in the harshness of the West, family was something to be honored, no matter how strangely it was formed. A month later, Sheriff Coleman paid another visit. This time, his face was not grim, but bewildered. He sat at Margaret's kitchen table, sipping coffee and staring at the 3 children playing in the yard. "Strangest thing, Margaret," he said, shaking his head. "I did some digging. Sent a letter to the administration for that orphanage in Deadwood Gulch. They sent one back. Said they have no record of you ever being there, no record of taking in 3 children. They claim they've never seen you or these children in their lives." Margaret just smiled, a calm, knowing smile. "Does it matter, Sheriff?" He watched James help Sarah climb a tree, watched Ellie chase a butterfly. He saw the easy affection between them, the profound love in Margaret's eyes as she watched them. "No," he admitted, a slow smile spreading across his own weathered face. "I suppose it doesn't. Sometimes the West gives us mysteries we're not meant to solve. Sometimes we just have to be grateful for the gifts we're given." As the years rolled by, Margaret's children grew. They were a constant source of wonder to her. They carried the wisdom of the place they'd come from, a deep understanding of life and loss that made them both kind and resilient. James grew into a strong, quiet man with his father's integrity. Sarah became a talented artist, her paintings capturing the soul of the prairie. And Ellie, with her insatiable curiosity, became the town's school teacher, beloved by a new generation of children. They never forgot where they came from, or the battle their mother had fought for them. It was the bedrock of their family, a story of a love so powerful it had bent reality, called souls across the void, and stared down the darkness. Margaret lived a long and happy life, passing away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 93, surrounded by her children, her grandchildren, and even her great-grandchildren. Her little ranch, once a vessel of silence and grief, had become the heart of a sprawling, loving family. After she was gone, her children found a letter she had written for them, tucked away in the family Bible. Her familiar, careful handwriting filled the page. "My dearest James, Sarah, and Ellie, you came to me when I was lost in the dark, and you brought the light back into my world. You believed I saved you, but the truth is, you saved me. You were always meant to be my children, just as I was always meant to be your mother. The sacks you wore were never to hide your faces from me. They were to hide my own fear from myself. When you finally trusted me enough to remove them, you weren't just showing me who you were. You were showing me who I was meant to become, a mother strong enough to fight for her family. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for holding on. Thank you for teaching me that love is bigger than death, stronger than loss, and more creative than we can ever imagine. Don't be sad that I'm gone. Just listen. Love doesn't disappear. It just changes form. I'll see you again, my darlings, in whatever form love takes next. Your mama, who loved you before you were born, and will love you long after she is gone." And so the story lives on, a testament to the fact that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about souls recognizing each other across an impossible distance. It's a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, in the loneliest of hearts, love can still work miracles. What would you have done in Margaret's place? When that shadow whispered to you in your husband's voice, would you have believed it? Or would you have trusted the love you felt for the children standing right in front of you? It's a question that gets to the heart of what we choose to believe in, the darkness of our fears, or the light of our love. If this story reminded you that there is still magic in this world and that love is the most powerful force in the universe, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Every week, we dig into stories that prove the world is far stranger and more beautiful than you can imagine. Thank you for watching. And remember to look for the miracles in your own life. They might not come with burlap sacks on their heads, but if you look with an open heart, you'll find them.